Hello friends, and welcome to video number 6 of this course, building a website application. As I told you, from this video onward we will talk about the backend which controls the activities of your web application. Now the backend usually consists of the controller, of the data access object, of the models, of the repositories, and the service classes, and some utility classes that we may need. This is the entire structure of the backend. In general, this is the entire structure. Now if you look to our application, you see whenever a user want to connect to his account or her account, usually it will enter an email and a password. Or if a user wish to register an account in your web application, it will enter his name, first name, last name, user account, user ID, email, password, all these things, and all these data will be sent to the server, from the server to the database, and it will be persisted in the database. And whenever the user want to log in, the user will use his email and the password, and this email and password will be queried against the data which is saved in the database to see if this user has the right, is authenticated to access to the application or not. This is the entire process. Now this process consists of all these parts, all these packages, starting with the data access object, then creating a model, and then the repository and the service layer. These are 4 layers which will be controlled by the controller. So this simple process, a user just enter his email and password, it will contain all this work in these 4 packages, and it will be controlled by the controller. Now we will go step by step, starting from the controller. And since this is a ready-made application, so in some parts I will not show you some things, because step by step we will understand each line of code that is written in this application. So having said that, let me start with the controller. Now every page, when you want to access it in your web application, it should be controlled by the controller. So when I click on contact here, I will be redirected to the contact page. This process is controlled by the controller. So at the controller package, we need to create a class by the name of main controller, and we annotate it with a controller annotation. So this will tell the project, the Spring project, that this class is the controller of the entire project. And from there, when any user wishes to enter to your home page, you need to create a routing for that request. When a user type your domain name and wish to access to your website, this controller will route the user to the home page, for instance, or to any other page. This routing process is represented by this method, and the method is at request mapping. The value is this. Now the value, since this is the home page, so we just need a slash. And then the method is a get method because this is a request to access a web page, so we have to put a get method. Now then we use this method and we give it a name, for instance show index page, and we use this model and view. We create a model and view object, and we use this model and view object to set the view the view is for the index page, because this is the home page. As we see here, this is the home page, so we need to use the index page. Now what is the difference between this and this? As you can see here, there is no model, while this page is just a normal page, a service page. There is no model here. So why there is no model? You see, every page that consists of a connection with the database, then you need to create a model for it. Now, since the home page here, it has a login form, which means this login form will connect to the database, then we have to create a model for it, a model class. That's why the service or the products pages, these two pages, they don't connect to the database, so we don't need to create a model for them. While same thing with the contacts. But for the registration, for the sign up model, when a user wants to sign up, this sign up process needs to connect to the database, because all the credentials of the new user will be persisted in the database. That's why we have to create a module. Therefore, the sign up or the register page, we need to create a model class for it. Same as with the login, because the login also connects to the database to query the data. That's why we need a model, and I will show you all the details about the model in a short while. So this way, if I wish to connect to the services page, I just add the services page, and you can see here in our resources what we do have here in the templates. We have services page, so we just create request mapping, get method, and the model and view, we create a model object which we have already created, and then we set the view name. So whenever the user click on the link of services, it will be directed to the services pages, service HTML page. The same thing with the products. It's showing on the header, there is a link to products. When the user click on it, it will be directed to the products page. So we just need a set view name. Now, on the same concept with the contacts, and on the register we need to create a model. And same with other pages. For instance, check email. For the check email, when the user want to reset his password, we need to connect to the database, because the user want to reset his password or her password. That means we have to connect to the database. That's why we need to create a model. Okay, and so whenever you need to connect to the database with a login or a register or check email or anything, you need to create a model for that. Other than that, you don't have to create a model. You just set the view name of that page, and that's it. Okay, so now we have learned about how we can route the request from any client who wish to access to the web application. Now we have learned how we can route this client to the desired page that he wish to access using this method, the request mapping with the get request. Now, when the user wants to connect to his account, enter the email and the password, we will query the data in the database. This process is explained in here as we have said. First, we need the data access object, then the model, then the repository, then the services, and all these 4 packages will end up in the controller class. So a simple login will take us to DAO. DAO implementation will require all these classes and interfaces just for the user to log into his or her account. So we will start step by step, first of all with the data access object, with the implementation, and then with the repository, and with the model, and then we end up with the service. And this service, it will be this service implementation. We will refer to it in the controller when we want to request posting the data from the login to the database. So we will use this service, which is the final step that started from the DAO implementation, repository, login model, login service, and ends up with the login service implementation. Then we use it in the controller. So we have to go through every step from here onward just to reach to the final point, final stage, final service, final layer. The login service is just a layer, and we can use it in the controller. Now for the DAO is the data access object. The DAO is just an interface, an abstract interface, which as per the definition of the DAO, it's separate the project from accessing directly to the database. So it's encapsulate the data that is connected from the DAO to the database. It will be encapsulated and it will be separated from the any outside access from the project. In this DAO, what we need to do is that we need to connect to the database, to any type of database or any type of data persisting mechanism. So the DAO will connect to any type of database or any type of data persisting mechanism. This is the only single objective of the data access object interface. Now what we need to do, first of all, when the user enter his email and password, we need to see, is this user already registered in the account in the database? This is the most important thing and the only important thing. So what we need to do is that we need to create a method which we call it validate user login. Validate user login. Is this user authenticated to access to the web application or not? And we will use this model, which I will explain to you in a minute. Now this method, we will create a class by login DAO implementation. This is a repository class. We will use the annotation of a repository, and we will implement this login DAO in it. Once we implement this login DAO, then we will implement this method that we have created in here. Immediately we will implement it. This implementation, which will happen here, is what we call the checking that this user is authenticated and it is registered in the database, and therefore this user is authenticated to access to this web application. The steps are easy. We just access to the database using the repository. So now, before we continue here, we move to the login repository. We create an interface by the name of whichever name you wish, and we will extend the JPI repository. This JPI repository will take two things. We'll take a login model, because we are dealing now with the login, and we'll take an integer. And in this repository annotation, in this login repository interface, we just create this method, which will has one objective, is to search for this user in the database. Is this user registered with the database or not? So this is the entire objective of this login repository, and we will use this method. We will refer to it in the implementation. So the implementation here is the login repository dot find by email, which is this method, find by email, and we will get the model from it. The model will bring the get email, bring the email from the database, and it will compare it to the data that the user have entered. This is the process. The user enter the data, the repository connect, bring the data from the database, and then it will be queried to each other, and we will see whether this user is authenticated or not. Now, since this is a Boolean method, means it's true or false. Either the user is registered in the database or the user doesn't have any registration in the database. So if the user exists, we create a Boolean variable. If the user exists, then we will give it true. If the user doesn't exist, we give it a false. We will return a false. And this value, we will use it later on, and I will show you where we will use it. But for now, this is the entire process of checking the user entry. Is it registered with the database or no? Now, for the login model, what is the login model? As you can see here, we have used it too many times. In the DAO, we use the login model. In the implementation, we use the login model. Even here, we have used the login model. The login model, if you remember in the database, when we created the database, we created multiple columns for the user ID, for the email, password, name, all these columns. Now the model, what it will do, it's a class that will map we create variables that will be mapped to the columns in the database. This is what the meaning of the model. It's just variables which will represent a mapping to the what is column available in the database. For instance, now here we create a user ID, a row number, the integer, for instance, an integer, a row number. This row number represent the user ID, the auth user ID, which we have created here. The other thing is the email. We created a variable by a field by the name email. This field, it will be matched, will be mapped to the column that we have created in the database, which is this column, the email column. Now we created another field, which is the password field. This password field will be mapped to the password in the database, which we have created in here, the passDB. This is the meaning of the model. And whatever data will come from the database will be linked to this model. Therefore, we can use, instead of using this column name, we will use the field instead. So this is the general idea of what is the model. It's just mapping the fields that we want to use. We have two fields here. We have the email and we have the password. So we will create two fields with the ID, this field and this field, and we will link it to the email column and the password column in the database. This is the entire process of what is the model all about. Now we need to annotate few things of these columns, of these fields. The ID, usually the row number should be an ID, and the column we should name which column this will be linked to. And for an email, this should not be empty at all. When a user wants to log in, he should put data in here. He should put an email here, and same with the password. So it should be not null, not null. And if it is null, and if he didn't place any data, if the user didn't enter any data here or data password here, then he should get a message saying kindly type your email, or whatever kind of a message you wish to add. Same with the email. If the email is invalid, he will get also a message, invalid email format. And then this is the column name that we will link from the database with the field. And then the same thing with the password. It should not be null, and it will be connected, this password column, with the field password. Now we need to create a super class, super constructor for this class, and we can create a constructor, and we also create a getters and setters. I believe you know how to create the getters and setters. It's a pretty easy thing. This is how you create a module. Now, two things you need to do. Don't forget, when you create a module, you need to implement a serializable interface, because all these data, when it will move from the database to the client over the internet, it should be serialized. This is number one. Number two, we need to use two annotations. The first annotation is we need to use the Java X persistent entity annotation, so that when you use this entity annotation, it means this is a model class. Immediately, once you use an entity, that means this is a model class. And number two, you need to connect this model class with which table. So you need to connect it to a table. We have created three tables here: users, user role, and role. So when we create a model class, we need to tell this class to which table this class should connect. In our case, we will connect it to the auth user, which is to the users actually. So when you create a model class, it's very simple. Two fields, the email and the password. We should annotate them with not null, and the email we can get a message, and we link it to the column, each one to the corresponding column in the database, each field to the corresponding column. Also, we need to implement the serializable, and we need to annotate it with entity, so that this class will be marked as a model, and then we should link this model class to a certain table, and we should write the name of the table, and then we create the super user and the super constructor, and the constructor and the getters and the setters for these fields. I hope this is clear now for the module, because this module, whatever data comes from the database, it will be mapped to these fields, so that the login DAO can use these fields, because as we have said before, there is no direct contact between the project, between the web application and the database. There should not be a direct contact. The database should be totally isolated from the project through the DAO interface. Through the DAO interface, the database should be isolated from the project. And the module will get us the data, and once we get the data, we can use the fields that we have created in the module to use them in the login DAO implementation. This is the implementation. Now when the user enters his user, login, email, and password, then the login repository will go to the database and will query the database using the JPA repository, and then it will tell us whether this email is registered in the database or not. This is the entire process for any login. And then the Boolean will tell us, is this user registered or not. To use this object of the login repository, you need to auto-wire the login repository class. You just auto-wire this class, you auto-wire it in here. Login repository and give the object some object name, whichever name you wish, and then you can use it here. So you can use this repository method. I'll talk about this, the encryption, but in general it is the hashing. Whenever you send, when the user write his password, and this password will go over the internet, this password should be protected in some way. This way is that we use this bcrypt password encoder. So it's not an exact encoder, it's just a hashing for this password to protect it somehow from being disclosed to any outside people who wish to get this password or infiltrate to the password. So this is just a hashing for the password that the user entered in here, and it's be sent over the internet. So there is some protection when we use this encoder. And of course the way to encrypt it or to hash it is just we auto-wire this class and we make an object of it, and then we hash it using this method .match, and we call the password. You see here we use the login model object from this class because the password that came from the database, it was linked to what? To this getter, get password of this field. So now you understand why we have to create the getters and the setters, and why we'll have to link the field with the corresponding column in the database. So here we using the object of the login module, get password, and if the user, this is the user exists, we get the password. Now this password is what the user have entered in here. So there are two passwords. One password is persisted in the database, and we called it and we retrieved it using the login object get password, and then there is another password the user have entered in here, and we need to match them to each other. If the match is correct, then that means the user have been found, and the password is correct also. Now there is one point. Some people don't use the DAO interface. They jump immediately to the login service. Now the login service, which is represent the, how to say, the mathematical layer, the logic layer of the implementation. So they don't use the DAO and the DAO implementation. They just jump directly to the login service. They put the same method, which is the DAO, and then they implement it in here in the service, and they make this implementation, they will make it in the service in here instead. I don't recommend this because the login, using the DAO interface will gives you a flexibility to connect to multiple databases. That's why I recommend it this way, but still it's totally up to you if you wish to go directly to use the login service and the login service implementation. Now the login service implementation, it just will refer to this implementation. So here, if you say validate user login, we will not do the implementation here. We will just refer to it to this implementation, because we done the implementation in here. The checking of the user account is done already in here. But some people, as I said, they don't do the DAO, they jump in here directly, and then this implementation will be done in here. In my case, I'm using a DAO interface, And on the service layer, I'm referring to the implementation which is available in the login DAO, which is available in here. And I prefer this way, and I recommend it to you, and the decision is yours, totally yours. Now once you have reached to this service, now we can use it in the main controller. As you can see here, login service, validate user login, login model. If it is true, as I said here, if it is true, that means this user is authenticated and can connect to his account. That's why we will move directly to the user logged in. This page is the account of the user. We will set the view name, as you can see here. So the login service, we call this method that we have created. If it is true, if the implementation is true, if we check the user and the user have the right and it is registered in the database, then we will route this user to his account page. We just use the login model or the view, login model view. We need to create a model and view, and we use it, and we set the view to the account page of the user, to his account page. And we can give a message that the login is successful. This is just a message to the user that his login is successful. Now, in case the validation have failed and this user is not authenticated to access to the web application, then it should be redirected to the same page. Should be redirected to the same page, and we should give him a message that this is a wrong email or a password, because the user could be registered but he used the wrong password. So if the authentication and the validation is correct, then we direct the user to his account page, we set the view, and we give him a message that the login is successful. If the authentication failed, then we return to the same page and we give a message that there is something wrong, either the email or the password. This is the entire process of the login, and why we create DAO implement, why we create all these interfaces and classes. Now, as you can see, I didn't go up for these things, because as I said, I will just focus on part by part, and gradually you will link these parts in your brain and you will understand the entire process. So this is how you log in your user and connect to the database and query the database and see if the user is authenticated to connect to the web app. I hope it's clear. The final thing, the final piece of this puzzle is about this method. Now, what is this method? You see, if we go to the index page, or actually to the fragments page, this is the fragments page. You remember we created a fragment for the login, and we called it, this is the login form, which is this one. When we designed it, we created just an HTML page to design the login form. In this login form, we spoke about the reCAPTCHA and some other things, but we didn't spoke about this line. This line is connected to this method, and I'll tell you how. You see, first of all, you need to give this form a class, just any class name. You call it a login form, and using the time leaf action attribute, and then this attribute you have to give it a name. Now this name should be the same name that you will use in the request mapping. And remember, this in this time, this is not a get method, this is a post method. Why? Because the user, when he enters this data, he will post it to the database. So this is a post method. So in the fragment, in the form, the action is that we need to connect to this method, to this request mapping. We will connect to this submit login, and the method request method is a post method. Now we give it a name for this method, whichever name suitable for you, and we will use this annotation, the valid and the model attribute. This model attribute is important. This name, the model attribute, should be the same as the name in here, which is the time leaf object. It should be the same name. And then the method, we will use it as a post, because again this is a post method. So this is the form. When the user enter his data, it will be sent to the database via this controller, and this controller should be linked to this via this action and the object. The action is the name of the method, of the redirect method, and the attribute is the login model, which should be the same in here. Okay, once you have done this, that means your connection between the HTML and the controller is being done to this post method. And then you have to use the login model object, because we used it in here for the login model. And one more thing, we need to use the model map. If you wish to add classes, if you had to add messages, you need to use this login map, because it has some attributes which can add to you some messages that will appear in here. These messages, if the login is success, it will appear in here. If the login is failed, the message is in here. So what we need, we use this model map, which gives us this object, and this object has some attributes, and you can add the name of this message. We give it a name, and then what is the body of the message. This is second thing. This session status actually is optional, but it's also benefit. It will tell you whether the session has been completed or no. Means the sending of the data to the database sent completely or no. One more thing. You remember when we were talking about the reCAPTCHA? Now we have reached to this request param, the gReCAPTCHA response, and we give it a name string captcha response. You remember this thing, the gReCAPTCHA, where we used it, and I told you later on I will talk to you about. Now it's the time to talk about this reCAPTCHA. This is the name. This is the gReCAPTCHA when we are preparing the reCAPTCHA. It will be used in here, so we need to use it in here. And pardon me, this is gReCAPTCHA response, and I will talk about it later, but for now you just need to, because this is another class that we will have to create it in here for the reCAPTCHA, the gReCAPTCHA response. So pardon me, this is not the one. What you need to do is, we will talk about it later for this line of code, the reCAPTCHA response. so we can use it when we verify the reCAPTCHA. So now we have talked about the login form. We have talked about the login form and the process of creating the DAO implementation, the model, repository, and the service, and how we manage to validate the user login and to see if it's authenticated to connect to the database, to the web application. One last thing to remember, this model attribute should match, as I said, should match the name in here, and also it should match the name in here. It has to match, these three places has to match the same name, otherwise you will get an exception telling you that the model is, there's something wrong with the model. You will know that exception when you have it, but from now I'm telling you these three places, the name of the attribute and this name of the model and the model in the fragment, they should be all the same. Hopefully you got the idea, and as I said, I will talk about these things piece by piece, and gradually you will link these pieces together so you can have the full understanding of the entire process of building a web application. Thank you very much.